At the gala celebrating the 50th anniversary of the corporation, I was honored amid the applause of hundreds of guests. The first time in my life that the name William Harrington was announced as a source of pride for the family. But just minutes later, my own family chased me away from the head table as if determined to erase me from their perfect picture. I stood up and quietly left, until Alfred Harrington, whom I still called grandfather, took the microphone and revealed a truth that silenced the entire room. And I, the grandson closest to him, couldn't help but be stunned and shocked when he spoke about my true origins. Hello, my name is William Harrington. You may have heard the name, or at least the Harrington surname, tied to articles praising one of Boston's most powerful financial dynasties. But I wasn't born into that dazzling spotlight. I'm an adopted son, an errant inkblot on the Harrington family's flawless canvas. And my story begins in the days when I was merely a silent shadow in the Weston Hills mansion, where everything was orchestrated like an unchanging ritual and I was forever an outsider. I grew up in a tiny attic room at Harrington Manor, a sprawling estate nestled in the suburbs of Weston Hills, where oak-lined streets and cold stone walls concealed every secret. My room was nothing like the lavish quarters of Vivian, Conrad, or Isabella, my adoptive siblings. It held just enough space for an old bed, a scarred wooden desk, and a tiny window overlooking a dark forest. In winter, cold air seeped through the cracks, leaving me shivering under a thin blanket. I would lie there, listening to the wind howl through the branches, wondering what I had done wrong to live such a life. The Harrington family was a Boston icon, a prestigious financial dynasty featured in the press with glamorous charity events and perfect smiles. My grandfather, Alfred Harrington, was its patriarch, a stoic, commanding figure whose piercing gaze could make anyone tremble. My adoptive father, Gregory, his only son, was cold and distant. My adoptive mother, Ruth, came from a prominent New England political family and carried herself with a regal pride as if she were the queen of an invisible kingdom. Then there were my siblings, Vivian, sharp and calculating, Conrad, arrogant and self-entitled, and Isabella, the sensitive youngest, the only one who looked at me without contempt. I knew I was adopted from an early age, not because anyone told me, but because of how they treated me. At every dinner, I sat at the far end of the table, where the light from the crystal chandelier never reached. The family's lively conversations about stocks, high society galas, or summer plans in Cape Cod passed over me like a fleeting breeze. No one asked about my school tests or cared what I thought. I learned to eat slowly, chewing small bites just to avoid drawing attention, and to keep the household's atmosphere as if I didn't exist. Ruth often looked at me with an icy stare. Once, when I accidentally spilled a glass of water at dinner, she stood abruptly, her voice sharp as a blade. "You'll never learn the manners of a Harrington, will you?" I bowed my head, silently wiping the table, feeling as if the whole room was mocking me. Gregory never looked me in the eye. To him, I was merely an obligation, something he had to endure. Vivian and Conrad, raised in indulgence, treated taunting me as a pastime. Only Isabella, the youngest, was different. Shy, with wide eyes and golden hair braided neatly, she would sneak to my attic room some nights when the house was asleep, clutching a tiny wooden horse or an old book. "I swiped this for you," she'd whisper, her eyes nervous as if afraid of being caught. I'd smile, pat her head, and murmur my thanks, but inside, a bittersweet ache stirred, warm yet painful. I kept those trinkets in an old tin box, proof that in this cold house there was still a flicker of warmth for me. But the one person who truly made me feel I had worth was my grandfather, Alfred Harrington. He was unlike anyone else in the family. He lived on a sprawling estate a few miles away, where he kept a horse ranch he cherished. Every weekend he summoned me, not to pamper me, but to forge me. "William," he once said, his voice deep and stern, "a man isn't defined by his surname, but by what he does." He taught me to ride horses, made me stand up each time I fell, and shared stories of building the Harrington Group from the ground up. He never spoke words of affection, but his gaze held no contempt. It was a look of trust. In Harrington Manor, I learned to survive. I learned to stay silent when mocked, to hide tears at night, to turn loneliness into motivation. I was smart, not by my own boast, but because my grades topped my class even though I attended public school while my siblings went to elite private academies. I didn't resent it. I told myself that one day I would prove my worth. Evenings when the family gathered in the grand living room, I stayed alone in the attic, reading or doing homework. I loved books on economics and history, stories of people overcoming adversity to achieve greatness. They fueled my dream of one day standing tall before this family, not as an outcast, but as someone they had to respect. Yet in my childhood years, that dream was constantly crushed by reality. Each time I descended the stairs, I'd hear Vivian's giggles or Conrad calling me the bastard when he thought I couldn't hear. My childhood passed in solitude and under disdainful stares. I learned to hide myself, to live without needing anyone's validation, except my grandfather's. He was the only one who made me believe that, though unwelcome, I still had value. And deep down, I knew that one day I would have to stand up and prove I wasn't the stain they thought I was. This is my story, a tale of a boy cast aside, yet never ceasing to dream of a day when he would change everything. At 18, I received a letter announcing a full scholarship for economics and marketing at a prestigious Boston university. It was a moment when I felt like I'd cracked open a small door, however humble, leading out of the shadows of Harrington Manor. I still remember the day I ran downstairs to the living room, my heart pounding, naively hoping that this time, just this once, the family would see me differently. But when I handed the letter to Ruth, she merely glanced at it, her lips pursed tightly. "Nothing remarkable, just a bit of luck," she said, her voice as cold as a winter wind. Vivian, lounging on the sofa with her legs crossed, smirked. "Oh, probably thanks to the Harrington name. Otherwise, who'd care about someone like you?" Gregory, as usual, skimmed the letter and muttered, "Let's see how long he lasts." Not a single word of congratulations, not a nod of acknowledgement. I stood there, the letter crumpling in my hand, feeling my small spark of joy snuffed out under their heels. A few weeks later, I left Harrington Manor with an old suitcase and a handful of books. The apartment I rented near the university was a cramped room with peeling walls and a creaky bed that groaned with every move. But to me, it was paradise. For the first time in my life, I was free, though the price of freedom was loneliness. I worked part-time at a small coffee shop, spending hours behind the counter pouring lattes and wiping tables to afford textbooks and rent. In those early days, I'd stand before the bathroom mirror telling myself, "You don't need them. You'll make it." But at night, when the streetlights cast their glow through the window, loneliness would creep in, tightening my chest. No one from the family checked in, but I still sent thank you cards every year, for Christmas, Ruth's birthday, or Thanksgiving. Simple, handwritten notes that read, "Thank you for giving me a home." I didn't know if they read them or tossed them into the trash with junk mail, but I kept writing, not to curry favor, but to remind myself not to become as bitter as they were. I didn't want to turn into their version of a person, living for prestige but cold as stone. During my 4 years of college, I threw myself into my studies. Economics and marketing weren't just about numbers or strategies. To me, they were a gateway to understanding the world, to finding a way to stand firm in a place where no one welcomed me. I stayed up late in the library, my eyes burning from reading under fluorescent lights. I took meticulous notes in every lecture, analyzing case studies as if each piece of knowledge was a brick for building my future. The pressure was immense, not just from academics, but from the feeling that I couldn't afford to fail. If I faltered, the family would have reason to mock me, to say they'd been right about me all along. Amid those years, my grandfather was a rare beacon of light. Alfred Harrington, despite his busy schedule running his financial empire, would occasionally appear. He never gave warning, just showed up at my apartment door in his stern black suit holding a few economic journals. He never praised me or offered empty encouragement. Instead, he'd place the journals on my table with a handwritten note. "Understand, don't just memorize." The words were like a riddle, but I gradually grasped their meaning. He wanted me not just to learn theories, but to comprehend how the world worked, how people fought and survived. Each time he left, I'd sit down, poring over the articles, jotting down what I thought he wanted me to see. It was the only way he showed his belief in me, and I clung to it like a drowning man to a life raft. Once I asked him, "Why do you care so much about me?" "I'm just the adopted kid." He looked at me, his gaze sharp as a blade, but his voice was low and deliberate. "William, a man isn't defined by blood, but by what he does with the opportunities he's given." I didn't fully understand then, but I memorized every word, as if they were a map guiding me through the labyrinth of my life. Those 4 years of college were a storm. I faced sleepless nights, grueling exams, and moments of self-doubt. Some days, I stood at my window, watching people pass by on the street, wondering if I truly belonged here. But I didn't give up. I couldn't let the family have another chance to ridicule me. I worked tirelessly, not just for high grades, but to prove I could overcome everything: their contempt, their isolation, and the wounds in my heart. On graduation day, I stood among the sea of black caps and gowns, my heart racing as my name was called. I graduated with honors, among the top of my class. As I stepped onto the stage to receive my diploma, I scanned the audience, foolishly hoping to see someone from the family. But only one person was there: my grandfather. He sat in the back row, leaning on his cane, his eyes fixed on me. When the ceremony ended, he approached and handed me a small box wrapped in red velvet. Inside was a silver pocket watch, its face intricately engraved with the word Harrington. "Keep it," he said, his voice a low command. "And remember, time doesn't wait for the hesitant." I clutched the watch, feeling its weight heavier than anything I'd ever carried. Then he continued, his voice soft but firm. "Come work for the Harrington Group. I need someone like you." The offer wasn't praise, it was a challenge. I knew he wasn't promising an easy path. The Harrington Group was a den of wolves, and I, seen as the adopted kid, would have to fight twice as hard to survive. After graduation, I received job offers from numerous major companies. Sitting in my small rented room, I opened each envelope with a mix of emotions. Names like Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, and other financial giants gleamed on the letterheads, promising a dazzling start. I could have easily chosen one, beginning a new life where no one knew me as the Harrington's adopted kid. But every time I reached for a pen to sign an acceptance letter, my grandfather's image appeared, his piercing gaze, his deep voice resounding. "I need someone like you." A small flame ignited in my chest. It wasn't anger, but determination. I would return, not to beg for recognition, but to prove I was worthy. I would step into the Harrington Group, face the scornful stares, and turn them into respect. On my first day at the Harrington Group, I walked into the towering skyscraper in downtown Boston, my heart pounding. The brass plaque engraved with Harrington Group shimmered in the sunlight like a challenge. I wore a simple black suit, the only one I'd bought with my own earnings from part-time jobs, and tried to maintain a calm exterior. But as I passed through the glass doors, I felt the icy atmosphere. Gregory, my adoptive father, stood in the lobby talking with senior staff. When he saw me, he gave a curt nod and signaled for an assistant to escort me to HR. No greeting, no smile. Minutes later, I was informed of my role: a low-level market analyst in the marketing department, a job any fresh graduate could do, no prestigious degree or scholarship required. Before I could process it, Vivian appeared, in a striking red business dress, her smile sharp as a blade. "Oh, William, did you think you'd be sitting at the top floor on day one?" she said, her tone sweet but dripping with sarcasm. Conrad, standing behind her, smirked. "I bet he won't last a month. Just wait." I didn't respond. I nodded, gripped my worn leather briefcase, and followed the assistant to my tiny corner desk at the back of the marketing department. Those first days at the Harrington Group were a brutal test. I was isolated. Colleagues, likely aware of my status as the adopted Harrington, kept their distance. They whispered behind my back as I passed, their eyes wary. Worse, during meetings, my ideas were often dismissed. "You lack experience," a mid-level manager said, not even glancing at the slides I'd spent all night preparing. "Let someone else handle this." I clenched my jaw, swallowed the burning in my chest, and returned to my desk. Complaining was pointless. If I wanted to change how they saw me, I had to prove myself through action. I began working like a machine. I arrived at the office in the pre-dawn mist and left when the streetlights glowed brightly. I read every report, studied every market trend, analyzed every number as if they were keys to my future. I refined marketing plans no one asked for, proposed ideas I knew wouldn't bear my name. I did it all in silence, needing no one's recognition, because I believed results would speak for me. But it wasn't easy. Some nights, alone in the empty office, I felt like I was battling an invisible monster. Vivian, now the PR director, frequently took credit for my work in successful campaigns. Once I spent 3 weeks crafting a promotional plan for a new financial product. When it exceeded sales expectations, Vivian stood before the board, beaming, soaking up the praise. I sat in the corner of the meeting room, watching her present my slides, feeling as if someone were squeezing my heart. Gregory, presiding at the head of the table, knew the truth, but said nothing. Only once, as I passed his office, did he look at me and say, his voice ice cold, "Don't dream too big, William. No one here cares what you do." Conrad, meanwhile, began spreading rumors. "He's only here because grandfather favors him," he'd say to anyone who'd listen. "Without Alfred, he's nothing." I heard those words not once but dozens of times in whispered break room conversations or sidelong glances in the elevator. But I didn't let them get to me. I learned to observe, meticulously noting everything, from how departments operated to how power flowed through the polished halls of the Harrington Group. I knew that to survive, I didn't just need to do well. I needed to outperform everyone. Occasionally, I'd catch sight of my grandfather in the headquarters hallways. He never spoke, just stood at a distance, leaning on his cane, his sharp eyes tracking me. Once I saw him outside the glass door of a meeting room, watching as I presented an idea that was later dismissed. When I stepped out, he gave a slight nod as if saying, "Good job, keep going." Those brief moments were my only fuel to keep pushing forward. After 3 years of silent toil, an unexpected opportunity arose. Thomas Reed, a senior executive overseeing global strategy, stumbled upon a report I'd written on sustainable investment trends. He called me into his office, a spacious room with windows overlooking the Charles River. "You wrote this?" he asked, pointing to the thick document. I nodded, bracing for criticism, but he smiled, the first smile I'd received from anyone in the company. "You've got potential, William. I want you to lead a project." The project was a marketing campaign for a new Harrington Group investment fund aimed at attracting major European clients. I dove in, working day and night, coordinating teams from New York to London. I analyzed data, built strategies, and persuaded the toughest partners. When the campaign concluded, the group secured contracts worth tens of millions. For the first time, the name William Harrington appeared in an internal report as the lead. That night, I stood before my bathroom mirror looking at myself and felt a flicker of pride for the first time. A year later, my outstanding performance earned me a promotion to Deputy Marketing Director. The announcement came during a company-wide meeting, and when my name was called, an odd silence fell over the room. I knew what they were thinking. The adopted kid. But I didn't care. I stood, bowed in thanks, and returned to work. Yet my rise fanned the smoldering flames within my family. At a company party, Vivian whispered to a group of employees, "He's just grandfather's puppet." Conrad, now Deputy Finance Director, began showing unease, his mocking glances replaced by fear. Gregory summoned me to his office, his voice icy. "You're climbing fast, William, but don't think you can outshine everyone." I didn't reply. I didn't need words. I just needed to work, to do better than anyone else. Every report, every campaign, every number was my response. I knew the path wasn't easy, but I'd promised myself I would turn those scornful stares into respect, not by begging, but by winning. At 30, I had become the head of marketing at the Harrington Group, a position I wouldn't have dared dream of years ago. Under my leadership, the marketing department achieved record-breaking revenue, transforming the Harrington Group from a well-known name in Boston's financial circles into a nationally recognized brand. Major publications, from the Boston Globe to the Wall Street Journal, began citing me as a rising young leader, a phrase that filled me with both pride and unease. Pride because I had proven my worth. Unease because I knew this spotlight only deepened my family's resentment. The Harrington Group was approaching its 50th anniversary, a monumental milestone marking half a century of dominance in New England's financial industry. A lavish gala was held at the Beacon Grand Hotel where crystal chandeliers glittered and tailored suits and evening gowns glided past one another like a symphony of power and prestige. I entered the ballroom in a custom-tailored black suit, my first ever, feeling as though I were stepping into an arena. Eyes turned toward me, no longer with the contempt of old, but with curiosity, even admiration. Partners, shareholders, and guests approached to shake my hand, congratulating me on the marketing department's achievements. "You've done the impossible, William," a New York executive said, raising a glass of wine in my direction. I smiled, nodded, maintaining a calm facade, though I knew each compliment was choking my family with envy. I scanned the room and saw Gregory near the head table, his gaze sharp as a blade. Ruth, in a pearl-colored silk gown, chatted with a group of high society women, but her eyes occasionally darted toward me, wary. Vivian, resplendent in a crimson dress, passed by with a false smile. "You look decent in that suit, William, but it doesn't quite suit the spotlight." Conrad, standing with a group of young shareholders, smirked when he saw me, whispering something that made them chuckle. Only Isabella, lingering quietly in a corner, offered me a small, hesitant smile, one that warmed my heart. The gala began with a speech from Gregory, his voice deep and commanding, recounting the Harrington Group's 50-year journey. He spoke of family spirit and an enduring legacy, but never once mentioned me. I wasn't surprised. I sat at a side table near the exit, listening to the thunderous applause, feeling like the boy relegated to the end of the dinner table at Harrington Manor. But then, something unexpected happened. A senior executive stood proposing a toast to those who had made exceptional contributions to the company. And the name called was mine. "William Harrington," the MC announced, "who has elevated the Harrington Group to new heights with outstanding marketing campaigns." The room erupted in applause, a sound like crashing waves. I stood, my heart pounding, and walked to the stage to accept a certificate of recognition. The chandelier's light shone brightly on me, and for a moment, I felt I truly belonged. I bowed, gave a brief thank you, and returned, not to my side table, but to the head table where the Harrington family sat, as the MC invited me to join them. As I approached, the atmosphere shifted. Gregory's eyes were ice cold. "This table is for family, not an adopted kid like you," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Conrad laughed, adding, "You'd fit better at the PR table, William." Vivian, feigning politeness, smirked with barely concealed venom. "Exactly. Don't make a mess of things." Ruth said nothing, her lips pursed, her gaze piercing. Isabella bowed her head, clutching her napkin as if she wanted to speak but didn't dare. A ripple of awkward laughter spread among nearby guests, then faded. A waiter froze, his tray of wine trembling slightly. Shareholders exchanged uneasy glances. A few coughed, trying to break the silence. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to freeze under the dazzling lights. I stood there, under hundreds of eyes, time seemingly halted. I knew what they wanted. They wanted me to leave, to be reminded I would never belong at this table, in this family. But I wasn't angry. I was too accustomed to their scorn. I gave a slight nod, a faint smile, and turned to walk back to my side table. The chandelier's light reflected on my face, calm in a way that felt almost surreal. I sat down, sipped my wine, and told myself, they can't chase me from my own dreams. From across the room, I felt my grandfather Alfred's gaze. He sat at the main table, his hand gripping his cane, his eyes steady and cold as if he had been waiting for this moment. I didn't know what he was thinking, but his look gave me an odd surge of strength, as if he were saying, "You did well. Keep going." The gala continued under glittering lights and polite laughter, but I knew beneath the glamorous surface a storm was quietly brewing. Sitting at the side table, I listened to speeches praising the Harrington Group, but my mind kept returning to the moment Gregory banished me from the head table. His words weren't just a rejection, they were a declaration of war, a reminder that I would always be an outsider in their eyes. But I didn't let it faze me. I had learned to turn scorn into motivation, and I knew that no matter what they did, I would never give up. As the room quieted, I saw my grandfather, Alfred Harrington, slowly rise from the main table. The crowd's murmurs faded, all eyes turning to him. Leaning on his cane, his presence remained commanding despite his age, his sharp gaze sweeping the room as if reading every thought. He signaled the MC to pause, then stepped onto the stage. The ballroom fell silent, save for the soft tap of his wooden cane on the floor. My heart beat faster, not from fear, but from a premonition that something monumental was about to unfold. He began speaking, his voice deep and deliberate, each word carefully chosen. The Harrington Group has journeyed through 50 years, from a small Boston office to a financial empire known worldwide. But today, I'm not here to talk about the past. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the head table where Gregory, Ruth, Vivian, and Conrad sat. I saw Ruth clutch her wine glass tightly, Vivian force a strained smile, and Gregory stare at him, his expression tense. Then his voice rang out like thunder in the hushed room. I am in the final stage of cancer. My time is now measured in months. The room seemed to stop breathing. Ruth covered her mouth, but I saw a glint in her eyes. Not just grief, but a flicker of anticipation, as if she were already thinking of the inheritance to be divided. Vivian sat up straighter, trying to maintain composure, her hands trembling slightly. Conrad and Gregory exchanged glances, their eyes a mix of shock and hope. The air grew heavy, as if everyone were waiting for something even bigger. I sat still, feeling as if my heart were being squeezed. My grandfather, the only man who believed in me, the one who gave me a reason to keep going, was slipping away. I wanted to stand, to run to him, but I couldn't. I just sat there, gripping my wine glass, trying to suppress the emotions surging within. Alfred continued, his voice unwavering. I have finalized all arrangements for the transfer of shares and leadership of the Harrington Group. Everything has been decided. The family exhaled, as if they already knew what was coming. Gregory sat taller, his eyes gleaming, certain he would be named successor. Vivian smiled faintly, and Conrad whispered to a shareholder beside him, as if preparing for his own rise to power. But then my grandfather looked out at the room, his gaze locking onto me. The sole successor of the Harrington Group, he said, his voice clear and resolute, is William Harrington. The room erupted in stunned silence. Whispers broke out, then died down. Gregory froze, his face paling as if slapped. Ruth gripped her chair's armrest, her lips trembling. Vivian and Conrad exchanged looks of panic and fury. I sat there, feeling time stop. William Harrington? Me? I couldn't believe my ears. I looked at my grandfather, searching for an explanation, but he stood calmly, as if he'd just stated an obvious truth. The ballroom buzzed with murmurs. Shareholders exchanged glances, some nodding, others shaking their heads. A group of senior staff whispered among themselves, their eyes assessing me. I felt hundreds of gazes on me, but I couldn't move. I sat there, still clutching my wine glass, trying to comprehend what had just happened. My grandfather instructed Gregory to continue the gala as planned. Then he turned to me, his voice soft but firm. William, come with me. I stood, my legs feeling weightless, and followed him out of the ballroom. Before leaving, he turned to Gregory and said curtly, when the gala ends, bring everyone to the manor. We need to talk clearly. I walked with my grandfather, leaving behind the crowd's murmurs and my family's furious glares. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew this moment had changed everything, not just for me, but for the entire Harrington dynasty. We stepped out of the Beacon Grand Hotel where the lights still sparkled and the music still echoed, but the atmosphere had turned frigid, as if the world knew a seismic shift had just occurred. My grandfather said nothing, only gesturing for his private driver to take us to his estate on the outskirts of Boston. I sat beside him in the Rolls-Royce, the silence suffocating. His gaze was fixed out the window, distant, as if lost in thoughts I couldn't reach. I wanted to ask, why me? Why make this decision in front of the entire family? But the words caught in my throat. I only clutched the silver pocket watch in my jacket, feeling its steady ticks, as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. "Grandfather," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "Why me?" "I don't understand." He turned to me, his eyes still sharp but now tinged with weariness. "You will," he said, his voice a low promise. "But not now. When the family is gathered, I'll tell the whole truth." I wanted to press further, but he raised a hand, signaling silence. I sat back, letting the burning questions smolder in my chest. We arrived at his estate, a sprawling property with endless fields and the horse ranch he cherished. I followed him into his study, a dim room lined with oak bookshelves and the faint scent of aged leather. He opened a safe, retrieved an envelope, and turned to me. "Keep this," he said, handing it to me. "But don't open it. Hold on to it until I ask." I nodded, feeling as if I were holding a ticking time bomb. He said nothing more, only told me to brace myself for the family meeting at Harrington Manor. When we reached the Weston Hills mansion, the family was already assembled in the grand living room after the gala. The air was thick, as if a dark cloud hung overhead. Gregory stood near the fireplace, hands in his pockets, his gaze sharp enough to burn. Ruth sat in an armchair, hands clasped tightly, her face pale but still regal. Vivian stood by the window, lips pursed, her eyes blazing with resentment. Conrad, lounging on the sofa with legs crossed, smirked as I entered, but his smile couldn't hide his unease. Only Isabella, sitting quietly in a corner, looked at me with a mix of worry and empathy. My grandfather took his seat in the large armchair, his cane resting beside him, his eyes scanning each person in the room. No one dared speak first. Finally, Gregory broke the silence, his voice trembling with anger. "Dad, what is this?" "William, that boy? Are you joking with the family legacy?" Ruth chimed in, her tone icy. "He's not our blood. You can't do this." Vivian stepped forward, hands on hips. "I won't accept this. He's just an opportunist exploiting the Harrington name." Conrad, unable to restrain himself, stood abruptly. "Grandfather, if you choose him, the company will collapse. He knows nothing about running it." I stood silently, feeling as if I were on trial, but I said nothing. I had learned to stay quiet in the face of accusations and scornful stares. My grandfather raised a hand, silencing the room. Then, slowly, he placed the envelope, the one I'd just held, on the table. "Open it, William," he said. I stepped forward, my hands trembling slightly, and opened the envelope. Inside was a birth certificate. My name, William Harrington, was written clearly, but what silenced the room was the line under father. Alfred Harrington. I looked up at him, feeling as if the world were crumbling. The room was still, save for Ruth's heavy breathing. Gregory lunged forward, snatching the paper, his eyes wild as he read it again and again. "Impossible," he muttered. Vivian and Conrad stood frozen, their faces ashen. Isabella covered her mouth, her eyes wide, unable to believe what was unfolding. My grandfather began to speak, his voice calm but heavy as stone. "I made a mistake in the past. An affair with my personal secretary, years ago. She became pregnant with William. A year after his birth, she demanded a large sum to stay silent. I gave her $2 million and she left, abandoning William. I brought him here, asking Gregory and Ruth to raise him as their own. But I know you never did." The family turned to stone. Ruth burst into tears, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were of shame and anger. Gregory gripped the paper, as if wanting to tear it apart. Vivian stepped back, shaking her head. "No, it can't be." Conrad stood motionless, his eyes vacant, as if his world had collapsed. Isabella looked at me, tears welling, but she said nothing. I sat down, feeling as if my heart were torn into 100 pieces. All those years of loneliness, scornful glances, and mockery now had an explanation. But it didn't bring relief. It only left me hollow, as if everything I'd believed was a lie. My grandfather, The man I called grandfather was my father, the only one who believed in me, yet also the one who let me grow up in rejection. He continued, his voice steady. William is my son, the rightful heir to the Harrington family. All arrangements are finalized. No one can change that. Gregory stepped forward, his eyes wavering between shock and rage. Dad, he said, his voice trembling. How could you hide this from us? How could you let that boy? He trailed off, unable to find words. Ruth stood abruptly, her hands shaking, her voice sharp as a blade. Alfred, you've destroyed this family. Do you think we'll accept this? My grandfather, no, my father, sat there, his gaze cold but unwavering. You had your chance, he said, his voice a verdict. You had decades to treat William as family. But you chose prestige, appearances, and pushed him to the margins. Now you face the consequences. He stood leaning on his cane, his presence still commanding despite his weakening body. This discussion is over. You'll know the rest soon. The room fell silent. I sat there, a cold void spreading through my chest, as if my heart had been drained of life. The truth I had yearned for, prayed for in those lonely attic nights, where I belonged, who I was, lay before me, but it brought no freedom. It was heavy, like a stone on my shoulders, leaving me numb, unable to cry or rage. I had dreamed of the day I'd learn the truth, but I never imagined it would feel like a cold, sharp blade, cutting through every belief I'd clung to. In the days that followed, Harrington Manor was shrouded in a somber atmosphere. I returned to my small Beacon Hill apartment, but my mind couldn't find peace. The birth certificate, now carefully stored in a wooden box under my bed, was a constant reminder that I was no longer William, the adopted son, but William, son of Alfred Harrington. Yet that title brought no joy, only an emptiness and unanswered questions. Why didn't he tell me sooner? Why did he let me grow up in isolation? And why even now, with the truth revealed, did I still feel like I didn't belong? Just days after the gala, I received word that my grandfather, no, my father, had been hospitalized. The cancer had spread, and his time was now measured in weeks. The family began visiting the hospital, but I knew it wasn't out of affection. They came out of concern for the will, for what he would leave behind. I went too, not to vie for anything, but because I wanted to see him one last time, to understand why he had done all this. In the sterile white hospital room, he lay frail, thinner than I'd ever seen, yet his eyes retained their sharp intensity. He motioned for me to sit, and when it was just the two of us, he took my hand, his cold and weak. William, he said, his voice raspy, I'm sorry. I let you grow up in loneliness, in deception, because I feared scandal. I chose honor over family. He paused, drawing a long breath, as if each word drained his strength. But you proved me wrong. You're stronger than I ever imagined. Don't repeat my mistakes, son. The word son rang in my head like a bell. It was the first and last time he called me that. I bowed my head, trying to hold back tears, but they fell anyway. I wasn't crying from sorrow, but from a tangled mix of anger, forgiveness, and a love I'd never dared acknowledge. A few days later, he passed away. The news swept through Boston, dominating headlines. Alfred Harrington, New England financial titan, dies at 75. The funeral was held at St. Matthew's Church, attended by politicians, financiers, and the press. Gregory maintained his cold demeanor. Ruth feigned tears for the cameras, and Vivian and Conrad avoided my gaze. I stood quietly in a corner of the church, not crying, only bowing my head to bid farewell to the father I had just begun to forgive. A week later, the family was summoned to the office of Henry Whitmore, the lawyer, in downtown Boston to read the will. The small meeting room, with its oak-paneled walls and dim light, felt oppressive. Gregory sat rigidly, his gaze icy. Ruth clutched her purse tightly. Vivian and Conrad whispered to each other, and Isabella looked at me with empathy. I sat at the end of the table, hands clasped, trying to stay calm despite my racing heart. Whitmore began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a verdict. The will had 3 parts: the transfer of shares, the division of assets, and conditions for recognition. He read aloud. William Harrington inherits 62% of the shares and control of the Harrington Group. The room exploded in a deadly silence. Gregory's knuckles whitened as he clenched his fists, as if restraining a storm. Ruth covered her mouth, her eyes wide, not just with shock, but with panic. Vivian let out a harsh, brittle laugh like breaking glass, as if she couldn't believe her ears. "What?" she nearly shouted, standing so abruptly her chair scraped the wooden floor. "I knew it. He's always been an opportunist worming his way into this family. Grandfather must have been manipulated in his weakened state. There's no way he'd choose him over us." She turned to the lawyer, her voice seething. "You have to review this. There must be proof this will isn't valid. We won't let him steal the family's legacy." Conrad glared at me, his eyes burning. "What did you do to Grandfather, William? What did you whisper to him to get this?" Whitmore remained unfazed. He set the will down and looked directly at Vivian and Conrad. "I assure you," he said, his voice calm but firm, "all procedures are legal. Mr. Harrington was fully lucid when he signed this will. If you wish to challenge it, the courts will decide. But I advise you to think carefully." His words were like a slap, stopping Vivian and Conrad in their tracks, though their eyes still burned with resentment. But the next part was even more shocking. The remaining assets, the Weston Hills mansion, the yacht, the vintage car collection, were granted to Gregory and Ruth on one condition. Gregory had to sign a document acknowledging me as his half-brother. If he refused, the assets would be placed under my management. The room fell silent, suffocating. Gregory stared at the lawyer, then at me, his gaze searing. "I won't sign," he said, his voice trembling with rage. Ruth grabbed his arm, whispering, "Gregory, think carefully." But he shook her off, stood, and stormed out. I sat at the end of the table, hands clasped, trying to maintain composure despite my heart pounding like it might burst. Vivian and Conrad's accusations didn't surprise me. I was used to their scorn. But they still stung like knives piercing my chest, reminding me that even with my origins revealed, I was still not accepted. I looked to Isabella, hoping for some comfort, but she only bowed her head, avoiding my gaze. Then I glanced at the will on the table, feeling it was more than a document. It was a sentence, not just for me, but for the family that had rejected me for years. I knew a storm was coming, one I couldn't avoid. Just days later, the storm truly began. Gregory, Vivian, and Conrad hired a top-tier Boston legal team led by Charles Langley, a notorious attorney known for handling high-stakes inheritance disputes. They filed a lawsuit to invalidate the will, arguing that my father, Alfred Harrington, had been mentally manipulated when he signed it. I wasn't surprised by their actions. I knew they wouldn't accept defeat easily. The press pounced, dubbing it America's costliest inheritance battle. Each morning, I opened the papers to find my name in bold headlines. The Harrington Group's bastard son. William Harrington, opportunist or legitimate heir. The Harrington Group's stock began to waver on the exchange. Investors grew anxious, and my office phone rang incessantly with calls from shareholders. During court hearings, I sat in the front row, facing the family's legal team. Charles Langley, with his smooth voice and razor-sharp gaze, painted a picture of a frail, vulnerable Alfred Harrington, easily swayed, and a cunning William exploiting his illness to seize the company. I listened silently, meticulously noting their arguments. I knew reacting emotionally would only weaken my position. Instead, I focused on my work, running the marketing department, preparing new campaigns, and addressing shareholders' questions with unwavering calm. Henry Whitmore, my lawyer, became an unexpected ally. He wasn't just my father's attorney. He understood his intentions. In one hearing, he presented a video recorded months before my father's death. In it, my father sat in his study, his voice weak but clear. "William is my only choice. He has vision, resilience, and most importantly, he isn't blinded by prestige." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "This is my will, and I am fully lucid in making this decision." Whitmore supplemented the video with medical records proving my father's mental clarity when signing the will. The courtroom fell silent, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Langley's eyes. Within the Harrington Group, the atmosphere was taut as a bowstring. The board of shareholders called an emergency meeting in the grand conference room on the 40th floor, where glass walls reflected Boston's light, a reminder of power and responsibility. I entered, feeling like I was stepping into an arena. The shareholders, dressed in expensive suits, eyed me with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Whispers of bastard and disputed will reached my ears. I stood before them trying to stay composed, though my heart pounded. Thomas Reed, the strategic director who had once believed in me, spoke first. "We're in the middle of a storm," he said, his voice low but firm. "But look at the numbers. Revenue up 18% last year. Williams' marketing campaigns brought in tens of millions. We can't deny his talent." Some shareholders nodded, but others remained silent, their gazes guarded. Margaret Klein, an elderly shareholder, stood, her voice sharp. "No one denies his talent, but can he lead an entire corporation? He wasn't raised as a true Harrington." Her words cut like a knife, but I didn't respond. I presented my case: numbers, strategies, achievements. When the meeting ended, the board voted. It was close, but I was confirmed as acting chairman. I left the room, feeling like I'd scaled a mountain, yet knowing steeper challenges lay ahead. Gregory, meanwhile, refused to concede. He poured his energy into tarnishing my reputation. In a televised interview, he stared into the camera, his voice icy. "William is a schemer, a selfish opportunist who exploited my father to seize the company. He's not a Harrington. He's a bastard." His words spread across Boston, amplified by tabloids into sensational stories. One day, entering the office, I saw an employee accidentally drop a newspaper with a bold headline, "Harrington Heir Usurper." I picked it up, glanced at it, then set it down without a word. Inside, though, it felt like salt rubbed into an old wound. Still, I chose silence. I didn't counter the accusations or appear in the press to defend myself. I knew words wouldn't change the minds of those already prejudiced against me. Instead, I focused on work. I arrived at the office before anyone, stayed later than everyone, reviewed every report, and led meetings with precision and dedication. Gradually, employees began to see me differently. The wary glances turned to respect. One night, as I revised a campaign past midnight, a young assistant, Anna, knocked and brought me coffee. "You work harder than anyone here," she said, her eyes sincere. "We believe in you." It was the first time I felt I wasn't alone in this skyscraper. 4 months later, the court delivered its final ruling. In the courtroom, the air was heavy, like a storm about to break. The judge, a woman with a stern gaze, read the verdict. "The will of Alfred Harrington is legal and remains in full effect." The gavel struck, ending the dispute. Gregory and Ruth, seated across from me, bowed their heads. Per the will's conditions, they had to sign a document acknowledging me as Gregory's half-brother to receive the remaining assets. The Weston Hills mansion, the yacht, and the vintage car collection. I watched them, Gregory's eyes burning with resentment, Ruth's lips tightly pursed, signing each word as if it were a death sentence. Vivian and Conrad didn't attend the hearing, but I knew they had lost, not just to the law, but to the truth they refused to accept. As I left the courtroom, Boston's sunlight poured down, but I felt no relief. I was now officially the chairman of the Harrington Group, the sole legitimate heir. But to me, the title wasn't glory. It was the end of an era of falsehood, of fake smiles, hollow praise, and scornful glances hidden behind polished facades. I stood before the Harrington Group building, looking up at its gleaming brass plaque, and told myself, this isn't victory, it's responsibility. I would lead this company not to prove I was better than them, but to protect my father's legacy, a legacy not just of wealth, but of belief in what I could achieve. In the days following the court's ruling, the Harrington Group entered a new era. The press no longer focused on the inheritance scandal, instead hailing me as the heir bringing the company back to an era of transparency. Those resounding words didn't make me complacent. I knew the power in my hands wasn't a reward but a greater challenge than ever before. I began restructuring the company, eliminating unwarranted family privileges and prioritizing competence and integrity. I dismissed employees who thrived on flattery, promoting those with genuine talent to key positions. Under my leadership, the Harrington Group's stock stabilized, revenue grew steadily, and the company embarked on a new, more robust phase of growth. Despite wielding power, I chose to live simply. My small Beacon Hill apartment remained my refuge each night, with its creaky bed and shelves overflowing with books. I avoided lavish parties and flashy interviews. To me, the spotlight wasn't where I belonged. I worked for responsibility, not fame. Each morning I arrived at the office early, reviewed every report, met with every employee, and listened to their ideas. I wanted the Harrington Group to be more than a financial empire, a place where people were respected for their contributions, not their names or backgrounds. After the ruling, my family quietly unraveled. Gregory and Ruth retreated to a small villa in Maine, living in seclusion, far from Boston's high society gaze. Vivian tried launching her own PR firm, but failed spectacularly when partners refused to work with her. Conrad left Boston without a word. I didn't feel triumphant watching them fall. Instead, I felt an indescribable sadness, not for them, but for the family I had once dreamed of being part of, now reduced to fragments. One early winter day, as snow fell lightly on Boston's streets, I was in my office when the door opened softly. Isabella stepped in, wearing a gray wool coat, her blonde hair braided as it was in childhood. She hesitated as if unsure of her welcome. "William," she said, her voice soft but clear. I have something for you." She handed me a letter, its envelope yellowed, Ruth's trembling handwriting on it. "Mother wrote it while she was in the hospital," Isabella said, avoiding my gaze. "She told me to give it to you." I opened the letter, each word cutting like a slow knife. "William, if I may, let me say I'm sorry. I was wrong to treat you as I did. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know." I folded the letter, my chest tightening. I looked at Isabella, her eyes now meeting mine with sincerity. "You don't have to forgive them," she said softly. "Just forgive yourself." Her words, simple yet piercing, cut through the armor I'd built around my heart for years. I didn't respond, only nodded, but something inside me began to shift. I had spent my life proving my worth, fighting scornful stares, but perhaps what I truly needed was to let go, not to forget, but to heal. That evening, I drove to Weston Cemetery where my father was laid to rest. Snow blanketed his headstone, inscribed with Alfred Harrington, builder of a legacy. I placed a bouquet of white roses at its base, stood in the biting cold for a long time and whispered, "I forgive you, Father. And I'll forgive myself." There were no tears, only a strange peace, as if I had shed a burden carried for 30 years. Back at the office, I took an old photo of my father from my drawer and placed it on my desk. Beneath it was his handwritten note. "Don't choose honor if it costs you those you love." Those words became my guiding principle, not just in work, but in how I lived. Years later, in a rare Forbes interview, when asked what made me strongest, I replied, "Not winning in court, but learning to forgive." The quote spread across social media, but to me it wasn't a statement. It was the truth, about a boy once cast aside who fought to prove himself and ultimately found strength in letting go of hatred. Years passed, and the name William Harrington was no longer just a headline. It became a symbol of a family's rebirth, once mired in prestige and division. As I took the helm, the Harrington Group ceased to be the cold financial machine of its past. I steered it towards sustainable investment funds, focusing on education, healthcare, and community development. I wanted the Harrington Group to be more than a money-making brand, a force for positive change, a legacy my father, Alfred Harrington, would be proud of. Every decision I made, from funding schools in underserved areas to investing in renewable energy, was guided by one question: does this make the world better? That's how I redefined the Harrington family's values. One of my proudest achievements was establishing the Alfred Foundation. The foundation was created to support orphans and disadvantaged students, offering scholarships, building schools, and providing opportunities for young people abandoned by fate, as I once was. I named it after my father, not to honor him as a financial icon, but to remember the man who taught me harsh discipline and, ultimately, that forgiveness is the greatest strength. At the foundation's headquarters, I had a plaque inscribed with my own words. Strength lies not in blood, but in how we treat others when given the choice. Each time I passed that plaque, I felt my father standing there, his gaze stern yet warm, as if saying, "You've done well." I led the Harrington Group with an unwavering principle. Respect is the foundation of lasting success. I once overheard employees noting that I was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, that I never raised my voice, not to an intern or a senior manager. They didn't know I was there, and perhaps I didn't need them to. I recall a rainy afternoon when the office was nearly empty, and a young employee, Michael, knocked on my door, hesitantly pitching a community campaign idea. Nervous of rejection, he faltered, but I listened, nodded, and said, "Go for it, Michael. I trust you." When the campaign succeeded, he thanked me, his eyes bright. No one's ever given me a chance like that. Those small moments were why I kept working, kept building a Harrington Group where everyone felt valued. As for my family, I had little contact with Gregory, Ruth, Vivian, or Conrad after the ruling. They chose their paths, and I respected that. When asked about them, I'd smile and say, "I didn't lose a family. I just learned to redefine it." To me, family was no longer those who bore the Harrington name, but those I chose to share my journey with. Dedicated employees, students supported by the foundation, and above all, Isabella. She occasionally visited, joining the Alfred Foundation's charitable projects. We rarely spoke of the past, of the cold days at Harrington Manor. Instead, we built something better: fundraisers for impoverished children, free classes for struggling students. Seeing Isabella smile with kids at a charity event felt like salvaging a piece of the old family, not through blood, but through compassion and understanding. My life, though busy, remained simple. I stayed in my modest Beacon Hill apartment, reading books at night and drinking black coffee each morning. I didn't need lavish mansions or glamorous parties. Happiness for me was seeing a student receive a scholarship from the Alfred Foundation, or an employee smile because their idea was heard. But deep down, I knew I still carried the scars of my past, the lonely attic nights, the scornful glances, the mocking words. They didn't vanish, but I learned to live with them, turning them into fuel to become a better version of myself. The lessons from those days of rejection, scornful stares, and lonely nights became my guiding compass. I understood that blood doesn't define a person's worth. Character and choices do. I once dreamed of being accepted by the Harrington family, but now I knew my value lay not in their name, but in how I rose after being pushed down, in choosing to do right even when no one was watching. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't weakness. It's the only strength that freed me from the shadows of my past. The taunts, the silent dinners at the end of the table, the painful truth of my origins. Forgiving Gregory, Ruth, Vivian, and Conrad didn't erase the scars, but allowed me to live unconfined by them. Above all, I learned that true family isn't where you're born. It's where you find respect and love. For me, family is now the employees working beside me, the students lifted by the Alfred Foundation, and Isabella, who chose to stand with me, not for blood, but for trust and shared purpose.